What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Latin American Politics. I feel terrible for you all because I know that you're locked up at home, uh, subject to a lockdown order. Is that right? That's all of California, or is it just Southern California? Somebody tell us in the chat. I have a feeling, though, that you're all stuck at home.
It's like 95% of California, I think, something like that.
So does that include Merced County?
Probably.
Okay.
Yes, we went back up to purple.
Okay.
There's a 10 p.m. curfew here too.
All right, I see. So you're stuck at home with a curfew and now back in the purple. I feel for you all. It's been such a terrible year between the seasonal fires and the lockdowns. California has it rough, and I'm just so happy that you're here with us tonight, despite everything. And I'm always so happy to come to this class. You're all such devoted students. It's really, one of my best classes. So I want to begin tonight by just doing a little bit of housekeeping and talking about where we are in the course. First of all, the research design papers have been graded, and I've given you some feedback. I'm very pleased with these. The average was about an 88. Generally speaking, you're off to a great start, and there's always room for improvement, but generally you did a really good job, and I'm excited about where you're headed with those papers, and I trust that you'll use the feedback that I gave you. Many of you have already contacted me as a follow-up to get additional input, and I really appreciate that, and I'm always happy to help you. Sometimes it takes me a day or so, or sometimes two, to respond because of the email volume, but I'm always excited to help you. Now, regarding the final paper, it's due on Friday, and I'll post the link on, I think, tomorrow morning, and so you'll have plenty of days to submit it. As always, I encourage you to do your best to make the deadline, but also just communicate with me if something comes up that prevents you from doing that. Obviously, these circumstances are extremely extenuating, and so I'm well aware that many of us are working under difficult constraints. Now, I'll comment briefly about the feedback and the timing of the feedback. Some students noticed that their feedback appeared a little bit later than the feedback for other students. The reason for that is just that I can't submit all the feedback simultaneously through CAT courses. I've got to do it one by one. And it takes a long time to do all the grading for 75 students. So it takes 4 or 5 days under good circumstances to finish all that grading, assuming I can spend a few hours a day grading. So if you got your feedback later than one of your classmates, that's why, because I can't do all the grading at once. And because CAT courses only lets me do one at a time, and I can only get to it when I can. Now, that being said, if you're an individual who received your feedback from what seems to you to be later than the other students, and if you feel like that affects your ability to do your best work, then I encourage you to talk to me. But I think for the most part, you should have some space and some time to incorporate the feedback that I've given you. With the understanding that you can take through Friday, and that I'm even flexible given the circumstances. The fourth item that I'll mention, I'm going to go ahead and post the optional extra credit assignment on Friday, and you will have a full week to do that. So you can do that whenever you have the time to do that and whenever you feel comfortable, if you choose to. You might not choose to do it, but should you choose to, you'll have a full week to do it. I just ask that you submit it, by midnight on December 18th. That's the next Friday. Now, as a reminder, that extra credit assignment will pretty much be like the format of the midterm, except that the content will be from the second half of the course. So you're encouraged to do that. I'll have more details on Wednesday about just how much extra credit you can potentially get, and we can address that more substantively on Wednesday if you have more comments or questions. But generally speaking, we're in really good shape here in the course. I think that you've worked so hard, and I'm especially excited about how well you're using the methods in your research. I always learn new things from students when they have the power to use the comparative method, and this is no exception. So many interesting ideas, such a good start. I can't wait to see what you come up with for the final paper. I think that about covers everything. I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. Sometimes professors don't like to address this stuff in class, but my objective is for you to complete the course and to do so well. And so there's nothing to hide here. Do you have any comments or questions about where we are in the course or about any of the above?
I have a quick question. As far as the essay, that will be our last thing that we submit, and then we won't have any classes, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, Wednesday is the last class meeting, and then Friday is the last day of the semester. So you can take through Friday to submit your paper, and I'll accept it, even though Wednesday is our last meeting.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Hi, Sandy. Yes, the paper is due on Friday. 80 says, do we have to write 3,000 words for our research paper? You do. That's roughly 12 double-spaced pages. The reason that I give you that is because that's a nice compact research paper. And considering that you'll have at least 2 cases, that should be a frame that you can fill out, in my opinion. Now, I realize that this is still a writing assignment that might be challenging if we're not writing a lot of papers, but I want you to be optimistic about the possibility that you'll actually have to make some difficult choices when it comes time to writing the paper. No, you won't be deducted points at all. I just ask that you make an effort to get in the neighborhood. So no one will have exactly 3,000. Just make an effort to get it somewhere in there. I remember when I would write papers as an undergrad, and sometimes they would be like 20-page papers. And I would often think that that was a little unreasonable, but I would marvel usually at the end at how much I actually had to say once I did the research and generated the argument and supported the points that I wanted to make. And so I want you to think of it that way. Try not to be, if you are at all concerned about the page length, try to think of it more from the point of view of, I want to learn everything I can about my question, and then I'll write a paper and I'll make choices about what to include and what not to include. Yendi asks, will we get a study guide for an extra credit final? No, you won't, because I'm going to give it to you on Friday and you'll have a full week to do it. So the study guide was designed partly to prepare you to complete the exam in an hour and a half when you took the midterm. Since you'll have more time for this assignment, if you choose to do it, I think it's appropriate to just give you the assignment. And in some ways, the assignment itself would be similar to the study guide that you would get. And so I think from that perspective, I actually want to save you the time that you might otherwise put into preparing the study guide, because there won't really be a time constraint for this extra credit assignment. Of course, 80. Are there additional comments or questions about anything in the class? Sorry to hear about the internet, Abel. So the extra credit assignment will basically be in the format of a final exam. It will include some concepts for definition and 1 or more essay prompts, short essay prompts. The idea is to give you something that engages your knowledge of the reading and your knowledge of the themes from the course that's similar to the midterm that you can complete relatively easily. but that would give you a chance to get the extra credit. So it'll be similar to the midterm, but it'll be new content from the second half of the course. Okay, so it looks like we're in good shape. Jessica has a question. We got a few more questions here. Do we have to start all over on the paper, or can we continue from where we left off on the research paper? Good question, Jessica. So what I would encourage you to do is to incorporate ideas that you wrote about and stuff that you wrote about in that design paper, but don't duplicate that material wholesale. So that research design paper was an outline, or sort of like a snapshot of your approach for the big paper. You don't want to duplicate the same text. You want to just kind of build on the ideas that you describe in that short paper. So you are kind of building on the foundation, and you're using the ideas, but you're not duplicating them wholesale. Sandy says, can we do some of the extra credit, or do we have to do all of it? I think theoretically you could do some of it, right? It just depends how much of the extra credit you potentially want to get. Juan says, can we use the same question topic that we used in the first essay? Yes, Juan, so that's the point. Remember that the research design paper was designed to get you to kind of do some of the early legwork, to get you to describe your approach to the big paper and kind of provide a snapshot of what you plan to do. So theoretically, your long paper should be an extension of that first paper. And so that was the point, to kind of get us thinking about the big picture from the start. And so there would be some continuity between the first and the second assignments. And also because I'm realistic, and I knew that giving you two papers would work better if they complemented each other and they weren't independent assignments. No, 80, you're not adding more cases. You're really just carrying out what you outlined in your research design paper. So maybe you're adding more cases if you, in your research design paper, only identified a single case. But assuming that you have two or more cases that you identified in your research design paper, you don't need to add more cases. Yindi says, if we answer incorrectly on the extra credit, will we be deducted points? So it's like an assignment, right? You'll be graded based on how many of the points for the assignment you got. It's just that all the points that you do get will be extra credit, right? So there is not a slot in the grading for this assignment. It's just that whatever points you get will go towards your grade. So you will be deducted points, but you're not losing points. It's all credit that you can potentially get added towards your overall grade. I'll talk more about this on Wednesday, and I'll have more detail about how much it'll be worth, etc. But I intend to be generous, and I want to support you and give you a chance to make the most of it, because as we talked about, very uncharacteristically, this class was never given a final exam slot. And so we don't actually have a space to take a final exam. But I still want to give you a chance to do some work for the class that would be meaningful and actually worth something. Okay, everybody, it looks like we've covered everything that we need to discuss. As always, I think it's great for us to make sure we're all on the same page. You might recall that we're discussing narcopolitics, and we've talked a lot about the experiences of Colombia and Mexico and Central American countries. We've talked about the United States and Western Europe as well. And one of the themes that's come out of this discussion is the continuing failure of the US-led drug war, and even some of the efforts of the Mexican government and other authorities in Latin America to eliminate the drug trade and to reduce violence between drug cartels. This failure is really distinctive because of just how much the drug war itself has actually cost. So before we continue the course and take up our newest unit, which is US-Latin American relations, we're going to go back and finish up this unit on narcopolitics. And we're going to do so by watching a video that illustrates and talks about that failure of the US-led drug war, the costliness of the policy. And then in a moment, we'll size up some broader questions about why the cartels are winning and what choices might be available to us when it comes to either opting for legalization or spending billions that wind up in the pockets of drug cartels. So our discussion will size up some of the key issues involved. Let's begin by watching this video.
The war on drugs is moving into a new crisis.
Violent cartels fight for their cut of an estimated $320 billion a year industry. The global production and supply of drugs such as cocaine are on the rise. Around 18 million people use cocaine globally, and the online world is making the drug more accessible than ever before. Britain, Spain, Australia, and the United States consume the most cocaine, but a higher percentage of Albania's population use the drug than any other country, partly because it's a significant transit country for cocaine. Poorer nations in South America are the main producers. Colombia, just 34th on the list of biggest users, produces over half the world's supply. A kilo of cocaine that costs $2,200 in the jungles of Colombia can fetch $12,000 to $16,000 in Mexico. But by the time it makes its way to Europe, the same kilo is worth $53,000 to $55,000. Organised crime gangs are finding increasingly novel ways to transport ever larger volumes of the drug to these lucrative global markets. Old cannabis smuggling routes are now being used to transport cocaine, such as the Bay of Gibraltar, where trafficking increased last year by an estimated 300%. Self-manufactured semi-submersible narco subs carry up to 7.7 tons of Colombian cocaine to Central America and Mexico. And traffickers are hacking into the authorities' monitoring systems to avoid detection. Global seizures are on the rise, but so is global production of the drug, now the highest level ever recorded. America spends $40 billion each year on the war on drugs. It arrests 1.5 million of its citizens annually for drug offences and locks up 500,000. But its tougher drug laws disproportionately affect the poor and minorities. Its zero tolerance on drugs has done little to curb addiction or overdose rates, which are the highest in the world. A rising number of global drug users and dealers now turn to the dark web to buy and sell anonymously, taking the war on drugs into uncharted territory. It's a battle the authorities can never win.
This is obviously a very flashy and well-produced video, but it puts in context all the different issues that we've discussed, everything from the role of drug gangs to improvements in technology and how they've facilitated the drug trade. It talks about consumption and profits and revenues generated by the drug trade. It talks about the efforts of states to combat the trafficking of illicit narcotics and so on and so forth. And it does all of it by pointing in particular to the role of Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, Colombia producing more than 60% of the world's cocaine. This video then puts in focus one of the most important questions of all, which is, why are the cartels winning? And this is a question I want to put to you before we wrap up this unit. This is a question that really puts in perspective or helps us think about all of the different issues that relate to narcopolitics and everything that just came before us. So does anyone want to take on this question or share their insight or their opinion about why the cartels are winning?
I think they're winning because there's such a need for finance. Families, I mean, their jobs are like shutting down. So because there's such a need for finance, and this is a way to make money. Families are willing to risk their lives even to make income to take care of their family.
So there could be scarcity. It could be the fact that families can't pay the bills and don't have an income. And the video itself pointed out that Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia are poorer nations. Now, realistically, Colombia is a middle income country. Peru and Bolivia might be a little less developed. It may not be entirely accurate to call Colombia a poor nation, but the point is a good one, which is, look, in places in Colombia, coca production is the only thing that pays the bills. It's the only crop that a farmer can produce and earn enough money to raise a family or to pay the bills or to feed themselves. So Deleonore is pointing out a very obvious and important point, which is that, look, it's a way to generate income in places that don't have other ways of generating income. And videos that we watched from last week highlight that too. That law professor talked about how the trade continues because, in part, the state doesn't have other ways of generating income for people, and people don't have alternatives. And so from this perspective, it's very easy to understand why the cartels are winning, because they benefit from the production of illicit substances that people depend on the production of in order to sustain their livelihoods. What are some other reasons that the cartels are winning? And what's another perspective? Christian says the cartels are winning mostly because it's easy work to get into. For those higher up, it's a way to get rich. Legalization at the very worst will give a way to tax the drugs, which can improve the living situation of many people in the country if the government uses the money to support growth. It comes down to the country, but legalization is probably the best way to make drug use easier to treat and more beneficial to the overall society. Deleonore adds, and they also have customers or buyers in high places. So there's also the consumption angle of it, which is that people continue to consume cocaine and marijuana and heroin and illicit drugs produced by and distributed by cartels. Once that consumption continues to increase, it's very, very difficult to reverse the process. Christian adds that there are some basic economic realities. The cartels are winning because it's easy work to get into. It's easy for those higher up to get rich. Christian also addresses another important dimension of this, which is the question of whether we should simply accept legalization or if we should give billions to cartels. And this is an issue that is especially important in the United States because we imprison so much of our population for minor drug offenses. Now, on this topic, it's actually interesting to note that the House of Representatives just approved a bill that would legalize marijuana and expunge all petty offenses related to marijuana possession. Now, whether it'll be taken up by the Senate is a separate question, and whether it will eventually be passed is a separate question too. But the issue of legalization is closely connected to the survival of these cartels, because legalization is a way to tear the rug out from under them when they rely on the survival of these black markets, which are only made possible when the drug itself is illegal in the first place. Maricela says, I think it has to do with the fact that the people are still afraid to speak up, and also the people do not have a lot of opportunities, so they have to protect the cartel since it's the only income that people might get to support their family and themselves. So insecurity is a serious challenge, and these developmental challenges that often relate to the well-being of people in the countryside who might not have alternatives often tell a lot of the story. You know, in rural Bolivia, in rural Colombia, there might not be much apart from coca production. You know, maybe you can produce cacao, or maybe you can produce some other cash crop. But the fact is, there's a substantial demand for coca, which is then used to produce cocaine. And so it makes good economic sense to grow coca, which will eventually become the ingredient in cocaine, which will be trafficked by the cartels. But that peasant in the Colombian jungle doesn't know the difference. And really, they're disconnected from what eventually happens to the coca that they produce. And so the insecurity, the reliance on coca production of ordinary Colombians and Peruvians and Bolivians is a big part of the story. And what we've seen so far from the video footage in class is that, with some exceptions, the Colombian state hasn't done a lot to create alternatives, with the exception of some programs like those that try to incentivize cacao production, with the exception of more rehabilitative programs that have often focused on limited land reform and some types of changes that can be beneficial. Juan says the cartels are winning as there are many things that have happened in the past that has allowed them to establish their brand and their reputation. At times, I think that they are able to win because these cartels are infamous for their reputation of the multiple murders. Samantha says, I think if there was no demand, there wouldn't be a profit. Latin American nations don't have high rates of addiction because it is expensive to buy when you have to choose between drugs and food. Absolutely. And there's also the fact that in Latin America, drugs are often provided by political parties in exchange for votes. Drugs and food can be so sought after because of the difficulty obtaining them that they're often exchanged for support. And so that goes to show you that levels of drug consumption are relatively low in Latin American countries, including Mexico. And so in Mexico, in Latin America, drug consumption is relatively low, but in the United States and in Western Europe, it's much higher. And so the supply and the demand have a lot to do with the thirst for consumption in the US. And moreover, different socioeconomic classes don't use drugs at even rates in the US. In fact, people of higher status and higher incomes typically use drugs at a higher rate. And they often are able to buy more of it, of course, too. So this helps you to understand some of the comments made by students in the last few minutes, where they've talked about how richer people, higher ups, are able to both benefit from the production as well as the selling and the trafficking, and also the consumption in the US. Juan says, which often leads people to not give them away as they are friend for their lives. People are often scarred, and some are bribed to turn a blind eye. Government officials are oftentimes involved, which makes it easier for the cartels to win. Boom. This is one of the most important things of all. The corruption in the bribing of public officials, extortion, and the use of threats of violence. All of these are important mechanisms for the cartels, but in particular, corruption and bribery. In Mexico, it's a significant problem, as we saw in the video footage. Police officers, members of the security forces, are bribed and paid off by the cartels to look the other way and permit them to operate freely. This is a significant problem, both because of how high the corruption reaches and because of the capacity of the cartels to purchase the loyalty of these officials. Sometimes it seems like no matter how much you pay the officials, the cartels can always afford to pay them more and make it worth their while to look the other way and permit the cartels to operate freely or to excuse their wrongdoing, as we saw in the video footage from Mexico. I'm going to create a poll before we continue, and I want to kind of get your pulse on this question about legalization. And let me create this poll and think about it for just a moment before I get back to you. All right, everyone, I'm launching a poll. I'd like to know what you think about this question. Would you rather accept legalization or live with the cartels? So 24 of 27 votes are in, 88% of the total votes. 23 votes have been cast, 24 votes now have been cast in favor of accepting legalization. 1 vote, or 4% of the total, has been cast in support of living with the cartels. And, because this is so decisive, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. I think that more than anything, the point of this exercise was to show you in pretty plain terms the nature of the trade-off. At this point, we've pursued the drug war for decades, but it hasn't been successful in any way. It's been successful maybe in reducing consumption of cocaine in the United States, but it has not been successful in reducing the supply of cocaine in Latin America. And as a result, the cartels have remained very powerful, and as we saw, are more powerful than ever, and are more violent and more bloody than ever. And corruption and bribery and bad behavior within government corridors continue to be problems as well. And so we have a stark choice, and it's really a choice between a radical shift like legalization or the continuation of a system where cartels remain very, very powerful and capable of flexing their muscles and pushing states around, like Mexico and El Salvador and other countries. It really is a stark choice between radical reforms that would take away the black market and propping up a system that distributes much of its benefit to criminal gangs like the 18th Street Gang and others in Latin America. So the solution may involve something along the lines of legalization, but it certainly doesn't involve a continuation of the supply side approach of Plan Colombia in the Merida Initiative. What I would submit to you is that the future may hold more sort of sympathetic and rehabilitative policies where we legalize drugs and treat these issues as public health issues as opposed to criminal or moral or ethical issues. And so Maricela says, I wish there was an option of none, because I think that if we eliminate one thing, another will rise. We might legalize some drugs, but there's always a new drug arising to keep people addicted to a substance they cannot get easily. That's a fair point, Maricela. And I think that maybe for that reason, there still needs to be some care devoted to analyzing which drugs are legal and which ones aren't. But I think that, someone might say to your point, they might say, well, at the same time, if you continue to focus on the supply side issue, and if you just try to eliminate drug leaders or drug gangs, there might just be a new gang that replaces it, right? And the geographic shifting of the distribution networks might also replace old patterns with new patterns. And so there might always be this game of sort of whack-a-mole, right? Where you're kind of always trying to hit a moving target. And what the solution is sort of an open question. And I acknowledge, Maricela, that maybe none is a third way. Maybe there's a different way of thinking about this issue that doesn't involve the two extreme options of the status quo or full legalization. Eddie says, I think accept legalization, one, because if they live with the cartels, they just let them win. Although most governments are corrupt and work with them anyways, legalizing would show that the governments are still able to have control. since the drugs will be distributed either way. It is a hard choice to make either way, as they should not have as much power as they do. So what I enjoy so much is that you are all thinking in these ways and thinking in these terms, and you're thinking about the issues involved. And really the issue is, the key question is, what is an acceptable distribution of power when criminal gangs are players in politics? And that's what narcopolitics creates. It creates a situation where criminal gangs and criminal organizations enjoy political power, and they enjoy leverage, and they enjoy the capacity to use corrupt means to push their weight around and to extort public officials and to operate freely. And so I think at the end of the day, the question becomes, what is an acceptable distribution of power? And does legalization mean eradicating these cartels? What does the future hold, and what might be an appropriate solution to the politics of narco trafficking and the drug war? Okay, everybody, so we're gonna shift gears and connect with a new unit that is a nice segue into a new set of issues that relate to the broader relationship between the United States and Latin America. And we'll focus today on Latin American relations, US Latin American relations. The reason this fits nicely with the narcopolitics unit is because obviously the US is the major consumer of much of the marijuana and cocaine produced in Latin America. And so as a consumer engaged in this game of narcopolitics, the United States has a sort of stake or a role to play. And the key questions that we'll address today are much broader in scope than the drug war, but they engage this issue of whether the US can be a force for good or whether it is a force for ill. And US Latin American relations is where we'll have this discussion. When we think about US Latin American relations, we think about the complexity of the relationship, first and foremost. And we think about perhaps the drug war and narco trafficking and narcopolitics represented here, where you see a hand reached out holding what appears to be a little pile of cocaine dust. You also think about coercive relationships between the United States during the imperialistic era, when the US pushed Latin American countries around and tried to keep European countries in their corner as part of an effort to dominate the region. We think about business partnerships and relationships between elites in Latin America and the United States. We think also about dissatisfaction and distaste for those gringos in their offensive and aggressive ways. But we also think about racism towards Latin Americans themselves. We think about a variety of different kinds of relationships, and there's no single face to US Latin American relations. And the first thing that we confront when we think about this topic is the complexity and the seesaw, the back and forth, the tensions, the cooperation and the way that it can be displaced by competition, in the way that competition can be once again displaced by cooperation. When you look at the period over the last 200 years, you'll find that there has been a seesaw, and Latin American countries have continually wrestled with US influence. That US influence has taken a variety of shapes and forms. And the question for us is how we can understand US Latin American relations systematically, and how we can understand these themes of competition and camaraderie, and how we can think about the evolution of the relationship. Now, as always, I want to begin with a couple different polls that will help us to kind of get a sense of where we are and how we are thinking about the key issues before we get started. And we'll address two questions. The first one is, has the United States been a force for good in Latin America, based on your understanding of the US role in Latin America so far in the course? And then secondarily, can the United States be a force for good in Latin America? This is a separate question. Not has the US been a force for good, but can the US be a force for good? we'll do these one by one. And again, I want to do this to sort of get a sense of your pulse, where you are on this, what our sort of angle or our perspective is. So give me a moment here, and I'm going to create a new poll. All right, everyone, I'm launching a new poll. The question is, has the US been a force for good in Latin America? Maricela asks, question, when you refer to force for good, in what sense? I just mean sort of in general, has the US had a positive impact or a negative impact in Latin America? Just kind of in general, overall, all else being equal. Now, this is really interesting. We're getting a lot of no's. The vast majority of you say no, but some of you say yes. And it's kind of complicated, right? Like, you can think of some examples of a positive impact, but you can also think of many examples of a negative impact. And this is sort of the essence of the relationship. It's very complex and complicated. And in some ways, it depends, right, on the administration or the time period. Maybe for you, it's easier, though, to point to either bad or good. And virtually all of us have voted right now already. And so I'm going to go ahead and share the results and point out to you that 88% of you said that the US has not been a force for good in Latin America. 3 of you, or 13% of you, said that the US has actually been a force for good. Now, before we continue, does anyone want to comment briefly on why they said either yes or no?
Well, I said no because the historical idea of US imperialism was sort of against being good for Latin America. As we saw, they kind of promoted their own interests in countries such as Cuba, such as, I think it was Nicaragua, but I could be mistaken. But whatever the country they occupied for almost a decade nonstop. So it was just a demonstration historically that they weren't trying to help Latin America so much as preserve their own interests.
Okay, so there's certainly the point about the promotion of US interests and military interventions in places like Nicaragua, in Cuba, and elsewhere. Obviously, that's very relevant, right? The gospel of democracy, very relevant. Can anyone talk about why they said that the US has been a force for good, and why they may have said yes? I can think of some arguments, but can someone share their input?
In this class, we haven't really focused directly on, like, American foreign policy, which is not the point of the class, so it makes complete sense why we focus like on more broad terms. But when you look at specifics within countries, especially in like Guatemala, the US has been nothing but a force for chaos. They started it with implementing Puerto Rico in like before World War II. Then they just reinforced so many like the Civil War in the 1950s. It was just so many things back to back with the US that when you look at these specific cases, you know that they're just using them because, especially during the Cold War, they couldn't afford to have Latin America be communist, and they can't afford to not exploit them and still be a successful nation. That's just my opinion, though.
So Samantha makes a really good point. When you think about Latin America as a whole, it kind of gets obscured, the experiences of any individual country, right? You think about maybe how the region at large has benefited from more economic activity, maybe how they've benefited from having the US and their support from time to time. But then if you think about individual countries, you think about like Guatemala and how US economic and political interests decimated that country, more or less, right? The United Fruit Company and military intervention and support for military coups in Guatemala, and how US economic interests dictated the US government's response to the efforts of Guatemala to simply establish democracy. You think about countries like Chile, where the election of a democratic socialist president resulted in his ouster 3 years later by the military, who was propped up by the United States and the CIA. These individual experiences sort of show you what thinking about the region as a whole doesn't, which is that every country, it seems, has had a bad experience with the United States. And when you go to Latin America, this is how Latin Americans often remember the United States. They don't usually have a very positive view, with some exceptions, but they certainly remember the military coups and the CIA support for military intervention and so on and so forth. And so on a country by country basis, you begin to see the individual experiences and how in reality, the US impact has often been quite negative. Of course, we can maybe think about examples of how it could have been positive as well. Those arguments might be more difficult to make, but I certainly can see examples of how you can make that argument. And so there are multiple views, and you can make compelling cases either way. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to create a new poll. This is a slightly different question. Maricela says, my cousin tells me that when she travels to some parts of Latin America, she says she is Mexican instead of American to be treated with respect. Touche. In my experience, if you talk to elites and powerful people in places like Chile, they might respect you for being American. But if you speak to ordinary people, they don't often have a very positive view, right? And maybe sometimes they might even think that you might be European because they don't want to think that you're American. But yeah, that's interesting, Maricela, and I can see that for sure. Let's add a new poll. This is the second question. I want to know, can the US be a force for good in Latin America? This is a question about, can the US be a force for good, not has it been a force for good? And I'm interested in seeing what your response is and how it might differ from the first question. We're already seeing a significant difference from the first set of results. The overwhelming majority of you say that yes, the US can be a force for good in Latin America. And this is what I was hoping for. I was hoping that on the one hand, you would recognize that US influence has been quite destructive so far because of the US promotion of US interests at the expense of Latin American interests. But I also wanted you to notice that the United States has the capacity to do a lot of good and to promote cooperation between Latin American countries and between countries in the northern and southern hemisphere, in North America and South America, and to promote hemispheric cooperation through joint military operations. They have the capacity to bring Latin American countries together. How they choose to use their power matters a great deal. And so a good example is the example of the difference between the Trump administration and the Biden, or the president-elect Biden administration. The Trump administration took a very hostile, aggressive stance regarding Venezuela, and even was open about supporting efforts to oust Nicolas Maduro, and was very vocal about supporting Juan Guaido, the opposition leader who has previously been the president of the Congress. Now, that's obviously a very aggressive position. Joe Biden, by contrast, has come out and said that a more diplomatic approach to Venezuela might be useful in brokering negotiation between the contenders and the parties in Venezuela. So accepting that the situation is complicated, and that maybe a brute force approach might not be productive. This is an example, I think, of how US influence can be more productive and positive. And whether it will be is a separate question, but I'd like us to acknowledge that with great power comes the potential to do great destruction, but also to be productive as well. Quinn says would require a major policy shift. Absolutely. Eddie says realistically, knowing how it is, the answer is no. However, it is a country with enough power and resources, so yes, if it was different. Touche. It's obviously, it depends, right? It depends on how that power is used and the potential within the US administration to make those changes. So this begins our discussion in our lecture on US Latin American relations. And we're gonna do this in 4 parts over today and Wednesday. We'll begin by discussing the sort of historical background, the pre-war US Latin American relations in the inter-American relations during World War II. We'll follow that up with a discussion of the Cold War period, and in turn, a discussion of the contemporary period, really basically beginning in the late 1970s and through today. Now today we'll cover basically through the end of World War II, but the goal will be to sort of set the historical context that creates the backdrop for the present day US Latin American relations. Before we continue, let me read Christian's comment. The main reason I say the US can be a force for good, especially today, is because of the many people who don't look at the Latin American countries as trash or less than. More and more people see the beauty and culture and inherent value Latin America has. People in my generation especially see this because their family comes from any number of Latin American countries. Touche, Christian, and we know that right now, Latin Americans form a larger percentage of the US population than ever before. And so the potential for cooperation is greater than ever before. And the relationships and the economic integration are really robust. And so remittances, for instance, connect the regions. And there's a lot of cultural and political similarity between the two. And so I think you're right when you say that there are generational changes and that there's the potential for a new relationship. Let's set out on this discussion and investigation of US Latin American relations. So our starting point is really the post-independence period, and the period when Latin American countries were sorting out their internal struggles and seeking to establish an identity and form a state. Now, as you know, this was a time of considerable US influence in the region, and in particular, there was the spreading of the gospel of democracy, as it was called. And this took the form of the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, and then subsequent to that, the Roosevelt Corollary in 1904. And both of these basically established US dominance in the region. European powers need not come over. You're unwelcome here. The idea being that the US would be the ones who would police the region, enforce debt repayment, and basically coordinate relationships between Latin America and the rest of the world. And the role of ideology in this process was especially important because it justified US imperialism. This idea of manifest destiny and the notion that US intervention was appropriate and legitimate while all others were not. This was a very US centric viewpoint, and it was a view of the world as serving the interests of the United States, not in any way the other way around. This was a setup for imperialism, if ever there was one. And as we know, there was significant imperialism in the promotion of US economic and political interests, in particular, well above the promotion of democratic consolidation or the growth of democratic politics in Latin America. And so you got a lot of different interventions in Nicaragua. US troops marched on Nicaraguan soil every single year but 1911, between 1901 and 1933. And this US imperialism spread fast and spread far. It wasn't just Nicaragua, it wasn't just Cuba, it was most countries in the region that fell prey to US intervention. There was an entire ideological architecture that justified this spreading of democracy, this kind of this sort of farcical spreading of democracy. There was the idea that Latin America was unpromising soil and that it wasn't conducive to democracy in its own right. There was the idea that Latin American political culture was fundamentally flawed and that it would only foster dictatorship by itself, and therefore US intervention, even if covered with a thin fig leaf, would always be better than the status quo. Interestingly, but also unsavory, this was sort of the origin of the political culture theory, the sort of Latin American tradition perspective. The idea that there's something about Latin America that's inhospitable to democracy and favorable to authoritarianism. This ideological architecture supported US intervention throughout the region. Between 1894 and 1934, there were more than 30 military interventions in the region. US economic interests motivated this intervention, but it was also geopolitical hegemony. The simple fact that the Roosevelt corollary in the Monroe Doctrine established the dominance or the claim of dominance in the region for the United States. So there were economic as well as geopolitical dimensions to this hegemony. But in all cases, it took the same form, which was the form of US intervention in the promotion of US interests over and above Latin American democracy. So this is a really kind of humorous but sincere campaign poster from 1900. This is a McKinley Roosevelt campaign poster that claims a humanitarian motive for Latin American intervention, and primarily in Cuba, where they just go the full 9 yards and simply refer to it as American rule in Cuba. Remember that this came at a time when Cuba had a pretty harsh dictator, and the United States had previously established a sort of protocol that compelled the US to intervene if ever there was any threat to Cuban democracy. Now, in this case, this Cuban dictator certainly threatened democracy, but he was protective of US business interests. And so the United States looked the other way and propped up this dictator and sort of presided over, in effect, the sort of collapse of Cuban democracy. But according to McKinley and Roosevelt at the time, this was a humanitarian decision, and it was represented as such in this campaign imagery from 1900. But this goes to the mindset at the time, in this sort of ideological space the country was in, where there was this justification for intervention born out of this savior role assigned to the United States, the manifest destiny, the role of imperialistic intervention in promoting democracy in otherwise backwards places that couldn't support it on their own. Now, this period of intervention stood in stark contrast to what came later, which was called the Good Neighbor policy. And the Good Neighbor policy was very, very different because it focused on goodwill and mutual respect, non-intervention and sovereignty, as opposed to intervention in the name of the promotion of some notion or concept of democracy. The Good Neighbor policy was very, very significant because it represented this sort of new age of US Latin American relations. How could it be that the US pivoted so suddenly? Why did they suddenly embrace goodwill and mutual respect, sovereignty, and non-intervention? Well, unsurprisingly, there were good reasons why the US did such a radical about face. In the first place, the prior policies had been ineffective. They had not been successful in winning over the adherents of the Latin American countries or really bringing them over to the US side. They hadn't established the kinds of relationships that they thought they would be able to establish and would benefit them. Those policies did not work. There was also the case that the US economy had continued to grow and Latin American countries had grown as well. And the US had more and more economic leverage over the Latin American countries as a result. And so they could use other forms of power that didn't have to be so overt and aggressive as military intervention. And then finally, there was the fact that the imminence of World War II meant that the United States had to find allies in the region desperately. They needed to find supporters and people in countries who would work alongside them in this looming conflict. The point is the US needed a new strategy. What they'd been doing was not working, and it was very, very costly, let's be honest. That much intervention, regardless of the scope of the economic interests being defended, is extremely expensive. And marching on Nicaraguan soil every year for 30 years and losing American lives in the process is also disastrous for morale and for US image the world over. And so for all these reasons, the United States pivoted sharply and embraced this new strategy of the Good Neighbor policy. The Good Neighbor policy had a number of different dimensions. The political dimensions were non-intervention, consultation, non-interference, sovereignty, basically, this recognition of the sovereignty of Latin American countries. The economic dimensions concerned trade and commercial integration, binding the economies and facilitating free trade between them. The ideological dimension was this distinction that was drawn between the New World, which was like the US and democratic liberal places, in the Old World, which was like the sort of totalitarian, backward-looking Axis powers and European powers of old that were confronting the United States at this moment in time. The result of the Good Neighbor policy was profound. It was solidarity during World War II, but make no mistake, the United States retained important influence in the region. The Good Neighbor policy did not represent a qualitative shift from earlier policy. The truth is the US retained and expanded its economic influence, and it also retained significant diplomatic persuasion. It still was the superpower in those relationships. And so the change in policy did not necessarily imply a qualitative shift underlying the relationships, even if more peaceful, solidaristic relationships replaced the more interventionist ones of old that the US had designed. So the Good Neighbor policy was represented with propaganda like this, where you see on the left this message of strengthening our understanding of our southern neighbors through the Good Neighbor policy and the embrace of the Latin Americans, whereas previously they were viewed more objectively. Here they're apparently being viewed with with more benevolence and with more potential compassion. On the right, there's this image of Americans for all and fighting for victory. And it's this idea of we are struggling for victory together, the Latin Americans and the Americans. Luchamos por victoria. We are struggling for victory. All Americans are struggling for victory. And this is a radical shift. This is a radical shift from the previous policy in Latin America. And so the good neighbor policy might get us closer to what we're inquiring about when we ask whether the US can be a force for good in the region, if in fact the US has already demonstrated the ability to create this kind of regional solidarity during an important moment. But even so, the United States did not go unrebuffed in its relationships with Latin American countries. Latin American countries responded to US imperialism during the period of the good neighbor policy and before it in a variety of different ways. Generally speaking, we can distinguish between capitulation, where countries decided to basically obey and kind of go along with the US, and resistance, where they decided to oppose the US and resist and go against the US. And more generally, and maybe more specifically, I should say, we can distinguish between choices to unify with the US, choices to move a separate direction and strengthen ties with European powers, choices to create sub-regional blocs that could contend with the US more effectively, and then finally, efforts to use international law to address US intervention and US imperialism. All of these represented different paths out of US intervention or US imperialism. And so we shouldn't treat Latin America as homogenous and as a single set of experiences. In fact, there's much more complexity, and no two countries responded in the same way. Now, inter-American relations during World War II took on yet a new sort of dimension. And this dimension is the dimension of increasing ties with the US and the deepening of relationships of dependence, in relationships that would be likely to sustain themselves through the conflict. This all began in the late 1930s when the United States became concerned about the spread of war to the Western Hemisphere. In Panama in 1939, there was a decision to establish a 300-mile neutrality zone. In the Act of Havana in 1940, created territorial sovereignty that sought to sort of reinforce and assert this neutrality and this sovereignty as well. And the goal is to establish and increase ties between the US and in Latin American countries. So the US sent military advisors to Latin America. It purchased weapons from Latin America, and Latin American countries purchased weapons from the US. And so this was a period of deepening economic and political relationships between the United States and Latin American countries. And the example of Cuba is an especially relevant example because of some of the interactions that took place in that country after earlier periods of imperialism and then the establishment of the good neighbor policy. So let's go ahead and watch a video that puts in perspective the Cuban-US relationship between the late 1800s and about the mid-1950s.
America is opening up relations with Cuba, and it's a big deal, ending decades of hostility and beginning a new era between the two countries. But to understand just how big of a deal, where that hostility really came from, why it took so long to end, you've got to go back, way back. Not to the 1950s, as many Americans might think, but to the 1850s. The story starts with America divided between pro-slavery and anti-slavery politics, and one of their many fights is over the Spanish colony of Cuba. Pro-slavery lawmakers want to buy Cuba from Spain, or take it by force to turn it into a new slave state. Anti-slavery politicians oppose this, calling it imperialism. But fast forward to 1898, after slavery is over. Americans have a different version of this same argument when Cubans rise up against Spain. The US joins them, starting the Spanish-American War. But Americans divide. Should the US seize Cuba from Spain for itself, or liberate the island? This is part of a much bigger debate at the time over whether the US should explicitly become a European-style imperial power. So this is an argument about Cuba, but it's also an argument about America, what kind of country it should be. Should America be the kind of country that controls Cuba, or that respects it as a fellow sovereign nation? And that argument has continued in different forms ever since. But at this point, in 1898, the fight happens in Congress. Each side passes laws trying to force their way. And it ends up with a weird split baby policy, with Cuba winning independence, but other quasi-imperial American rule. The US would take over Guantanamo Bay, dictate Cuba's foreign policy, and give itself the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. Then came the American interventions in Cuba in 1906, 1917. Each time, the US military takes over for a few years, ostensibly to resolve some political crisis, but that usually means protecting American interests, such as sugar imports. But today, when Americans think about the US and Cuba, we think of the Cold War, but Cubans often think back to this imperial era. And that era technically ends in 1933 with an uprising against Cuba's government. Under US law, America is supposed to intervene again, but President Franklin Roosevelt wants to end the imperial era, so he declares neutrality. And over the next 20 years, Cuba becomes a democracy, and one that's generally friendly with the US. That changes in 1950.
Okay, so this takes us from about 1850 to about 1950. And as we see in this short video, the relationship between the United States and Cuba showcases all of those different stages. It showcases the imperialistic stage, the good neighbor policy, and all the while, it illustrates the tug of war in the United States and the conflict between those who wanted to seize Cuba wholesale and those who wanted to let it be free and to liberate it. Ultimately, what happened in Cuba around the 1900s and during those first few decades of that century is that Cuba was free, but essentially under some sort of quasi kind of limited American rule because of the United States' responsibility under law to invade, to preserve democracy and freedom in Cuba. And so in Cuba, we really have a different set of considerations, and we have the different interests in the United States sort of imposing themselves. And the relationship between the US and Cuba then is an interesting kind of microcosm of US Latin American relations as a whole. This does conclude our lecture for today. We will pick up on Wednesday, right where we stopped, and we'll continue discussing Latin America and the United States. We'll talk about the Cold War period and then the contemporary period, and we'll get up to the present day, and we'll eventually conduct an analysis of some of the similarities and differences between the present day and the past. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and I'll see you on Wednesday.